Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Baker. Thank you very much for the warm introductions. I think we have a video that needs to play before I kick things off. Could we activate that?
Meeting global carbon emissions targets will require trillions of dollars of investment in new green technologies and infrastructure. But how can we get the money to where it's needed? The voluntary carbon market can help. Many companies have made or would like to make net zero emission commitments, but they aren't yet able to transition away fully from fossil fuels. By buying carbon credits, they can offset their current emissions, making it possible to meet their promises. This drives capital to those projects that generate credits by reducing or removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Green projects can therefore receive the funding they need to grow. But robust legal standards are needed for the voluntary carbon market to function efficiently. In response, ISDA has published new industry documentation for the trading of carbon credits. The 2022 ISDA Verified Carbon Credit Transactions definitions establish a consistent contractual framework that can be used regardless of the credit type or the registry that issues it. Having one set of documents allows users to trade carbon credits more easily and globally, setting the conditions for this market to flourish. Voluntary carbon markets will play an important part in meeting global emissions targets, combined with industry efforts to ensure integrity and transparency. ISDA's new definitions will help this market to grow safely, efficiently, and at scale. Visit ISDA's website for more information.
Fantastic. Thank you both for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here at this London Blockchain Conference. And firstly, that animation was a great explainer and courtesy of Scott's organization, ISDA. So thank you for allowing us to use that, Scott.
You bet.
So we just introduced voluntary carbon credits, and these are part of the financial derivatives market that is part of the global emissions management and helping organizations around the world discover standards and ultimately start the journey of being able to use risk management contracts to help mitigate emissions in their corporations. And we're going to open up our panel today to talk about how the world of ISDA and financial services through the lens of derivatives is meeting blockchain and the journey towards digitization and automation. So firstly, I have to set the context a little bit further in that this morning we put out a press release announcing between Tokenovate, the business that I found and run, which is a smart contracts platform building on the BSV network, my good friend here, Hirander's organization called GMEX Group, and the exchange that they work with is SECDEX, and a carbon ecosystem. It's a network of networks called 013, and indeed building on the ISDA toolbox and some of the standards that ISDA has brought to the market for voluntary carbon credits. We successfully completed the first spot trades and the first forward trades as smart legal contracts on the BSV chain over the weekend. So I'm really delighted that we've been able to collaborate on this. This is a world first. Nothing has executed as a derivative on the Bitcoin network in history. And to do this as a Bitcoin scripted contract was truly amazing. So to my team and the team that supported, thank you. So as we bring these two worlds together, we've got a lot to unpack. So maybe I think for the audience it would be useful if, Scott, I could direct to you. Who is ISDA and what is it all about? What does ISDA do in the world? And particularly, I guess, as it relates to standards, what's the journey that you've been taking the organization on?
Well, thank you for having me at this event. I had a quick selfie with our video at an event like this. Our worlds don't normally collide except on certain projects, but we're going to have a lot more opportunity to work together in the future, traditional finance in this community as well. ISDA starts off 35 years ago with developing standard legal documentation, standard definitions that you saw on the voluntary carbon market. We also have now evolved our latest definitions we released earlier this year around Bitcoin and Ether definitions, starting to standardize those products. But we also have a suite of counterparty documentation, a master agreement, CSAs for collateral exchange, and this is all critical to documenting and supporting the trading of derivatives. So ISDA is a 1,000-member in 90 countries organization, 35 years old, and supporting that standardization. Several years ago, I gave the team kind of the direction that we need to move into the digital 21st century because we had all of our documentation, all of our definitions, and all of our protocols on paper. And it was just obvious that we needed to catch up. And so our mandate is to digitize everything. Now, we're taking that in bits and bytes, but we are standardizing using standard clauses so we can automate those and put those on any sort of digital protocol, including chain. We're standardizing definitions, taking some of the legal flexibility and standardizing that to give a more robust, consistent documentation and definitions. And then we're also underpinning that with a common domain model that we're working with other trade associations to document and establish consistent life cycle standard definitions and terminology. Again, enabling standardization, digitization, and then fully automation is kind of our journey that we're attempting to achieve there.
And I think for those of you that don't know, I think because of ISDA's longevity in the market, I think if we look notionally, there isn't an asset class in the world that isn't really touched by ISDA in some form. Most counterparties in the world will enter an ISDA master contract to ultimately trade, whether it's a physical delivered good or a cash settled paper good. And so whether you're in energy markets or commodity markets, now digital assets, ISDA touches everything. So I guess with that reach, Scott, obviously the bit that has excited us is ISDA's done a lot of forward thinking in terms of codifying that master agreement. And we see it through the lens, I guess, of economic fulfillment. Right. Counterparties have risks to each other and they need to financially settle. But increasingly, obviously, there's a very large legal fulfillment. Yeah. Default, insolvency, bankruptcy. You know, and in the way the world operates, this agreement is critically important to how the world functions and our financial systems. So when you tackled the digitization project, where did blockchains and digital ledgers and smart contracts feature in the early phases of how you approach digitization?
The membership kind of said we need greater certainty around this to go all in. As you noted, you know, the derivatives business is gross notionally, is a $600 trillion business. It's global, and it relies heavily on sophisticated counterparties, but it also relies on rule of law and clarity. And that is super important in terms of making these investments and understanding also what happens when things go wrong. Two functions of ISDA documentation. One is to facilitate the trade. Standard terms, standard definitions, standard counterparty agreements, so you don't spend a lot of time negotiating that. You really focus on the deal. At the same time, it also prescribes what happens when things go wrong. And things do go wrong over time. And you have to think about what are the consequences. So while we do spend a lot of time defining the definitions and standardizing the contracts, we're also unpacking legal questions. What is the bankruptcy treatment going to be? And that's key in terms of both digital assets and voluntary carbon markets. What is the legal treatment? Are they property? Are they intangible assets? Dematerialized assets are a different legal treatment. And we just want to nail that down. So when you make investments with your counterparties, whether it's interest rate products or digital assets, you have certainty as to what happens when things go wrong. What court will opine on this? What will the outcomes be? Can you net these products? Those are critically important to making large investor scale decisions.
Yep. So just slightly ahead of bringing you into this, Hirander, I just want to introduce the bridge of these two worlds for a second. So Tokenovate got created just over a year ago as a smart contracts company. And I've been working in and around the BSV blockchain for the last 6 years or so. And I think when I looked at the way ISDA had started to effectively build a rules engine and codify this master agreement that touches so much of the financial markets, the reality was that we now stood a chance of connecting it to a smart contracts environment and building out the next stage of digital infrastructure and automation. I think blockchain is beautifully built for financial services. Indeed, Bain kindly took us through the journey of financial services is the lead use case for blockchain adoption in the world today. And we're seeing trillions of dollars of assets being digitized, tokenized. And with bringing those assets into custody, we also start to see the trade life cycle change. So it paves the way for all of these contracts to start to be served by smart contract workflows. So at Tokenovate, we've joined forces with some of the BSV ecosystem companies, but we've actually built a rules engine, a state machine, and we've taken advantage of the Bitcoin scripting language and the underlying opcodes that are based in the Bitcoin protocol. So we program the opcodes to fulfill the functions of the ISDA derivative. And my team and I are here at a stand in the show, so please do drop by, and we happily go deeper on the way we've approached building smart contracts on the BSV network. There's too much to unpick on this panel. So Hirander, firstly, thank you for your partnership. It's been a pleasure working with you and your team over the last few months.
Likewise, Richard.
You've approached this differently. I won't say you're a veteran of the financial services market, but you've been in the exchange space and more recently the blockchain domain and the digital custody domain. Tell us a little bit about GMEX Group, 013, and indeed the way you've been approaching digitization in that creation of the 013 ecosystem.
Yeah, sure. So, 28 years in financial market infrastructure. I mean, time flies when you're having fun, right, Richard?
Right.
But yeah, looking at this, I mean, so my background and then the background of GMEX is enabling financial market infrastructure. And we've approached this from less of a crypto native standpoint, but more from the perspective of regulated markets and how some of those institutions that deal in regulated markets can then go digital as well. So, when we looked at that, and there's been various announcements. One recently with TPICAP, the world's largest interdealer broker, enabling kind of institutional trades on their exchange into multiple custodians, and that was out last week. But actually, as we started to look at digital assets and regulation, we also came across voluntary carbon markets as an asset class. And this became really interesting because as we looked at it, everyone said, we want to set up an exchange or we want to interact. But we thought it was a little bit like the cart before the horse, actually, because exchanges, I mean, the technologies existed for some time, of course, centralized in centralized form, and obviously now decentralized. But actually, when we looked at the nuances of the market, the exchange or executing between two counterparties was one part, but actually we saw the supply side and the demand side were totally fragmented. It was almost like boxing organizations on the supply side,
yes.
The WBC, the IBF, and whatever else. And I know the World Bank with the Climate Action Data Trust is trying to resolve that, as are others for transparency. And also on the market side, you had everyone kind of doing their own thing. So we kind of said, there's all these vertical silos. There's no interoperability between the TradFi side and the digital side. There's multiple blockchains. And we actually saw that doing the work that we've just done, Richard, it lent itself really well as a use case for tokenization and to do the work that we've done mapping to the ISDA definitions. Because at the moment, you've got to understand, I mean, the drive to net zero is essential.
Yep.
You've got greenwashing, double counting. There's a number of large firms that have made net zero claims, but some of them in the US, like Delta Airlines, it was in the press today, are being taken to court as a result. So the eyes of both consumers and others are very much on this as well.
Yep. And I think, Scott, obviously ISDA's got a role here in terms of the voluntary carbon credit definitions that you brought to market recently, and hot on the heels of that was also the digital assets definition. So sticking with the VCC market and linking, I guess, to the ecosystem strategy, I think we have to be realistic. There's a period of time where standards need to be reset in the voluntary carbon market. And maybe just to characterize this properly, there is a current carbon market, and that is the regulated or certified market. And that market is already $1 billion annually. But that is ultimately government-issued certificates, ETSs. And what we're now looking at is the voluntary carbon market. And as your animated video really identifies, we've got very big drivers in this area where corporations, to meet their ESG goals, are the natural buyers of sequestered carbon sinks, the sellers. And so the standards are critical to allowing those counterparties to find each other for the right type of contract. So in the standards work, or the definitions work that ISDA has been working on, What are you doing with the World Bank and ISDA and the ecosystem and the regulators? How do ISDA approach trying to find the maturity in those standards?
Yeah. Well, we certainly want to make sure that we facilitate the highest standard we can in terms of addressing the greenwashing concern that these are being fraudulent or double counting or any of these other, any concerns. They've got to be transparent. They have to be auditable. They have to be clear. And we have to be able to document all this. So it's super important that we do this. And whether, a lot of people have talked about putting it on chain, and that makes there's a terrific argument for that. And making sure that firms can go to prevent reputational damage when they purchase these things. And when they purchase them, keep in mind, they're funding an important project, our little tree. They're funding either nature-based solutions or they're developing technology-based solutions that need this investment to pioneer and move to the next level of sustainability. So they're critically important to drive that behavior. And with the net zero pressure, firms committing to this, they have to figure out how they reduce their emissions and then offset what they cannot reduce. And that's where these voluntary carbon offsets come in. And we need those to be absolutely robust and resilient in terms of auditability and transparency. A high level of confidence that you're not going to get a press article saying, oh, these are the same credits that so-and-so bought 6 months ago. And to make sure that we have that, we really have to make sure that we have high standards to prevent double counting. The Integrity Council for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets is working through some higher standards, and we're encouraged by that. And when they produce those, we will take those standards, we will integrate those into our definitions. So the next version of the definitions are going to have those higher standards and requirements to protect them.
Fantastic. So I guess in the way you've characterized, there's pent-up sell-side opportunity with sequestered sinks, resources around the world. I think when we listen to that, Hirander, you're also talking about regions of the world that are densely populated with tropical forests. So we've got mass land planted with hemp farms. We've got large-scale peat that shouldn't be dug up anymore. I think we see this year the European markets stop exporting compost. You're not allowed to dig peat bogs up anymore. So we've got a challenge in that there is offset markets, there is ultimately mitigation of emissions, and these projects are complex, and the definitions are not hard, they're not easy to get to, because you're talking about a lot of underlying metadata that describes either a bio or nature-based project versus a physical infrastructure project. So when you're talking to sellers and you're trying to bring that liquidity into the market, how do you see digital assets, tokens, and the blockchain and smart contracts playing into solving some of those challenges?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Richard. And actually, we know this as well in terms of climate change risk, because SECDEX is an exchange, and it's fully regulated out in the Seychelles. And actually, a lot of those outlying islands around the main island are very at risk of being underwater over the forthcoming years as well. So, even where that exchange is based, as an example, is one example of climate change and the threat that ensues. If we look now, look at the industry, and take a simple lens with it. There are lots and lots of vertical silos, and to me, been in infrastructure and financial market infrastructure for that long. We've seen as consumers a smartphone, develop, and originally from the old bricks that we had in the 80s. Some of you won't have been around that long, but I certainly was, and Richard was, even though he probably looks much younger than I do. But as we look at this, we then went smaller and smaller in terms of mobile phones. We went from analog to digital. Yeah, it's really, really surprising when you look at financial market infrastructure. We're pretty much around the time of the early 1990s. Yep. Like when markets went from floor-based to quote screens and then order-driven and beyond, and we haven't evolved at all. And yet, and a lot of the time, when we speak to proponents, and we deal a lot with financial institutions, asset managers and banks. Yeah, there's a few people in there that get it and the power of this technology, but a lot of them are actually applying it, and they're saying, okay, blockchain is looking for a problem that it can be a solution to, but actually, in essence, it's not really solving those challenges, because what they're doing is applying the technology into those silos rather than using it for its true purpose. That's where smart contracts are really the future. Yeah, there are challenges with them as well, because if you look, I mean, here the Law Commission have acknowledged them and recognized them. In other jurisdictions, if you look at Seychelles, it's work in progress. As Scott rightly said, it's a process, not an event as well, even the way that those definitions evolve. So I think we're going to see global standards and some consistency in terms of legal frameworks, and there's certainly discussions there, and standards bodies like ISDA and others have a key part to play with that. But essentially, if we look at now just these trades that we've executed, they're transparent. We're not saying brokers are bad, because there is room for brokers, but there's less intermediaries, there's lower cost. We're also applying these contracts now to something called social carbon, where initially the project owner might get $5, right? But then those credits are sold second, third, fourth hand, and ultimately there might be $500 generated on them, but the project owner in the community only gets $5. But now with a smart contract, you can program on the onward sale unlimited a number of times the level of value, and that can then go back to the community. So things like this are fundamentally game-changing.
It's almost like we rehearsed this, Hirander. That's just beautiful, because obviously the reason that I think Tokenovate built on the Bitcoin protocol also is it's inherently a peer-to-peer digital cash system. So inherent in that system is a rewards mechanism. And when we're really talking about sell-side assets that digitize and become tokens, those tokens get moved into digital custody, and global regulators will sit over the way this is governed into the near future. But those assets are then either over-the-counter traded through brokerage facilities, or they're exchange traded in many marketplaces they're going to appear in the world. And just for reference, whilst we focused on the voluntary carbon markets, as we said at the beginning, ISDA spans all instrument types, all asset classes, and indeed Tokenovate's engine is built to be asset class agnostic. And what is exciting about this is that we're really looking at a very significant transition in financial services over the next 7 to 10 years, as we see those assets get digitized, as we see digital custody become more and more and start to, I guess, challenge the clearinghouse model and the cost of the clearinghouse model. There's a more real-time network here. But what excited us with the work with ISDA is you went to the effort of creating in your common domain model, the conditional logic output in JSON form of this contract, which allows us to pick it up and program it into a template-based script smart contract. And it gives high fidelity, so the events that we can report to the chain at every stage of the process actually increases transparency in the market. And I think for instruments like voluntary carbon markets, this is a very important aspect of improving trust in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm referencing this because a recent report talks about 45% of sell-side or of corporate-side buyers aren't entering the market because of greenwashing, because of fraud, because they're worried about the corporate risk. So I think blockchain has finally met a use case that actually, through the implementation of these various tiers, it sits inside a regulated environment driven by high standards. So we touched briefly, Scott, on the standards and definitions work on digital assets as well. As I say, ISDA's reach is wide. So maybe also just before we close out the panel, just so we talk, but ISDA and its approach to digital assets, why definitions in that asset class? And how does that interwork or the relationships ISDA has with the regulators like the SEC and CFTC and the future, I guess, of crypto assets or stable coins being securities, tokens, commodity tokens, without going too deep? How do you see this playing out into the near future?
I was a former CFTC regulator at one point, so I have maybe a slight bias on this one. But at the same time, where we're going to focus our time and energy is really working on those essential standards that both Richard and Hirander talked about, making sure that the legal certainty is clear. Developing clarity around the treatment of smart contracts in various jurisdictions, nailing down those questions, exploring and developing reliable, consistent definitions that people can use and code and apply. We're not the technology provider. We're making these solutions, these digital solutions available to all. The common domain model is open source. We take direction really well. As I noted earlier, we're a member-driven organization, so we have traditional finance. We have 30 natively digital firms like Richard's firm, as Tokenovate's a member, and we build consensus. And bringing people together to figure out the next set of problems and how we're going to solve those is really the consensus mechanism. And then once you establish that, like digital asset definitions, then you have a common set of standards that people will willingly apply because they understand them, they've contributed to them, and they understand how they've come about. And we're solving the most urgent problems first. And so when working through those, now there's plenty of people out there, larger trade associations, that have a view on whether they're securities or not. That's not really our strength in terms of there's no consensus within our trade association for that, because we're very focused on these very fundamental standard setting processes and solutions.
Yep. Oh, perfect, perfect. So I guess last point here I'd like to just touch on is you mentioned, as we see the sell side assets coming in, that I guess the real message behind the 013 initiative is that as a network of networks or ecosystem strategy, we have to accept that people will digitize on different chains as different tokens for a period of time. So we've got an interoperability challenge to face in the short term. How is 013 and GMEX Group addressing this?
Yeah, it's great. As much as we love, the work we've done on the BSV blockchain, we've got to take a wider view and acknowledge that other chains do exist, right, Richard? But
I don't think so.
No, they don't. We'll be in denial, I guess, for this one. But the important thing there is actually a network of networks approach is important. Actually, I see us getting to a position where we have cross-chain atomic swaps, right? And Scott will enjoy that. Maybe a panel in a few years' time, and we're certainly seeing that. So what we saw this, we said, okay. With 013, which is an initiative under GMEX Group, we're saying, okay, APIs aren't going away anytime soon. We know that on the financial market infrastructure side, there is legacy, the TradFi world as well, and equally even payments and everything else is all API driven, whether it's SWIFT and newer forms of open banking. But on the other side, there are multiple chains. Of course, some more preferable than others, depending on workflow. So the interconnectivity between those different constructs becomes really, really important on that network of networks. And also, we can't look at what we're doing completely kind of standalone on an island, so to speak. What we've got to ensure we interconnect with other ecosystems, and the net effect of that, leads to more and more critical mass and adoption in the industry. And may the best chain win. And we hope, in your case, it's BSV.
Yeah. And look, I think you've come across enough projects where cost of that infrastructure matters, the scalability matters. Whilst interop is something that we need to deal with, there's certainly other panels that have talked about this is a chain of chains. We can certainly host those other environments over time. So I think there's a pathway through all of that. It just takes work and effort to make sure that we can figure out those ecosystems and support them. So look, we've only got a minute left. I think, firstly, thank you both for joining me. This was a phenomenal use case to bring to the BSV blockchain event, to now see financial services in this highly regulated world through the lens of standards meet this BSV blockchain world is fantastic. I think other panels have talked about the importance of the Bitcoin protocol being a stable protocol, a layer 1 protocol, that inherent scalability, the commitment to scaling unbounded block sizes. I think when we look at the quadrillions of instruments that are traded in financial services against these standards, we need a network like this to deal with that type of scale. So thank you for your collaboration, and thank you for your time here today.
Thank you.